It's time to talk about the quintessential Hammer horror film. At least that's what Marcus Hearn called this movie. Marcus Hearn is like a Hammer horror scholar. He talks about these movies all the time. He actually wrote this awesome book. I mean, look at this thing. And you gotta take him seriously, right? He wrote a book. He's not just some random guy on YouTube. And he called this the quintessential Hammer film, not because it's the best, but because it's like a checklist of every cliche, everything you could possibly expect to see in an old gothic Hammer horror film, you find in Dracula, Prince of Darkness. What's going on, my friends? Welcome again to the Cobweb channel. My name is Daniel. Thank you so much for coming back to this review series that I'm doing on all of the Hammer horror Dracula movies. And if this movie is a checklist of Hammer horror tropes and cliches, let's go ahead and make that checklist as we talk about this movie. So this film was directed by Terrence Fisher, written by Jimmy Sangster, the same team that made the first two movies. And what's interesting is while this is the third film in the series, it's kind of like another part two. You see, the actual part two in this series is The Brides of Dracula, and that film brings back Peter Cushing as Van Helsing, but does not bring back Christopher Lee as Dracula. Now, in this movie, it doesn't bring back Van Helsing, no Peter Cushing, but you get Christopher Lee back as the Count. So, take your pick. Which part two do you prefer? Which one is better? Let's talk about it.
If you wish to see the destruction of the horror spawned by Count Dracula, come with me. But I warn you, it is not a sight for the squeamish.
And the fact that this is a sequel is really driven home with the very beginning of this movie, because this film opens up with a flashback to the final scene of the original film, Horror of Dracula, where Professor Van Helsing defeats the evil Count. I actually read that a huge chunk of the budget for this movie was eaten up by this flashback, because they had to get the rights to it. While both films are Hammer films, for the first one they partnered up with Universal, so different studios, different rights. And I think they thought this flashback was necessary because this movie's 1966. The original film was 1958. So it would have been 8 years since the last movie. And think about it, there's no home video in this time. You only saw Horror Dracula since 1958 if it happened to play again at your local theater or it happened to play on TV. So I think it was important to really remind people where this story last left off. From there, we go into the opening credits, a pretty darn good title card. I don't think as good as the first two movies, but we do get the main theme from the original film back. It's a slightly different recording, but we've still got that brr, brr, brr. The film proper opens up with a funeral procession. Outside seems to be near some kind of swamp. During this period of Hammer, you're going to see a lot of scenes that are out like in the woods or something like that, because you got to think it's very cheap to make period pieces period accurate if you're just in the woods. But this funeral procession seems to actually be for a vampire. And just when someone is about to stake the dead, perhaps undead body of this young girl, who shows up but actor Andrew Keir. Andrew Keir actually did quite a few Hammer movies. He was the best Quatermass, in my opinion, in Quatermass in the Pit, the third film in Hammer's Quatermass series. He was also in Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. But anyway, here he is as Father Sandor. And Father Sandor is going to turn out to be our eccentric vampire hunter of the film. But here he's not actually hunting vampires. He's hunting superstitious pseudo-vampire hunters. He comes up and just scolds all of these stupid townsfolk, just absolutely lays waste to their dignity by saying, "You are wrong. This girl is not a vampire. She's just dead. Dracula has been dead for 10 years. You need to get over this." And this is actually pretty interesting because, one, it's actually a subversion of a trope. You know, Marcus Hearn said there's so many tropes in this movie, and we'll get to some. But here, the people who believe in vampires are kind of wrong. And I also like that this tells us that even though Dracula is dead, his legacy and the fear of him lives on. But Father Sandor is actually not our main character. We then go to a local pub where we meet our group of lead travelers. These are 4 people, 2 brothers and their wives, who are traveling across Europe trying to broaden their minds, as they talk about a lot. And we meet Charles, our main character, absolutely chugging beer. He's played by Francis Matthews, who I really liked in Hammer's previous Frankenstein movie, The Revenge of Frankenstein. If you've seen that, you know how good Francis Matthews can be. And the way I describe these characters is these are like our posh, well-dressed, adult British dumb teens in a slasher movie. Yeah, despite the fact that they clearly appear like typical characters in an old-timey gothic horror movie, They kind of fit the slasher archetype because they're just these fun-loving people who are going out drinking, having a good time, going across Europe, and are probably gonna get picked off one by one by an evil monster. Well, they're actually not all fun-loving. You've got Charles, you've got his wife Diana, they seem great. You've got Charles's brother, who's like such a nothing of a character, I didn't even bother looking up the character's name, and his wife, Helen. Now, Helen, first thing I'll say about her, she is played by Barbara Shelley, and I am a huge fan of Barbara Shelley. She's one of my favorite. She is my favorite actress of Hammer horror films. My favorite performance from her is as the female lead in The Gorgon, which is an awesome like Medusa monster horror movie that Hammer made back in the early 60s. But she was also in my previously mentioned Quatermass in the Pit. She's awesome in Rasputin the Mad Monk, which actually came out the same year as this movie. But here she is playing the stick in the mud character.
That was the third time you supplied everybody with drinks.
I know!
They don't appreciate it, you know. They just think you're a fool.
The only character who doesn't seem capable of having a good time. Now, when I'm looking past these characters, looking around this pub, I just gotta say the atmosphere of it is a big step down from the pub that we saw in Brides of Dracula, which was unbelievably gorgeous. This one, a little more drab, but the drabness is about to go down significantly when who shows up but Father Sandor. He comes in out of the cold and he goes to warm himself by the fire, and he's got this fantastic moment that really points to how eccentric he is.
Oh, it's easier to warm oneself this way. Fortunately, my calling still allows me the luxury of a warm posterior.
Yeah, he's just lifting up his cloak, warming his posterior.
One of the few pleasures left in life.
That really shows us right off the bat that he is a priest or a monk, I'm not 100% sure to be honest with you, who is fun and like speaks his mind, is very blunt, and we can tell he's going to be a good character to follow in this movie. Now, it wouldn't be a horror movie worth its salt if our fun-loving travelers were not warned that where they are going is cursed. It is a horrible place and they should not go. And Father Sandor provides our crazy Ralph moment there. You know what? Let's make this the first check on our list. The warning not to go to their destination, not to go to Karlsbad. And as long as we're checking off tropes, we've got a big one right here where the driver drops them off well before their destination and says he will go no further. And they even speculate like, okay, he's probably just a robber. He wants to take our luggage, but he throws their luggage on down to them and is like, nope, I am leaving. If you're still here at dawn, I'll pick you up, but otherwise I'm out of here. Now our characters have got a decision to make. Do they go to the spooky castle and try to seek refuge, or do they go to their other alternative?
Well, there's the alternative.
You know what? They're looking at that like it's a bad thing, but that cabin looks pretty cozy. I mean, I'm in a cabin right now, like way out in the woods. I mean, there's no vampire castle in front of me or anything like that. It's like 5 miles down that way. It's time to make another check on our list of tropes because a mysterious empty coach comes up. Yeah, it's a coach. A beautiful one with no driver, with 2 horses, just magically appears, and you would think this seemed very suspicious, and it definitely is to Helen. Helen seems like the stick in the mud. She seems like the one who just can't go along with anything, can't have a good time. Charles is pretty annoyed by her for this, but she's gonna be the voice of reason throughout much of the movie. Charles thinks this is great, encourages them all to load up on into this coach. Now, Charles, you gotta love him. He's beer drinking, he's having a good time. He's the kind of guy you want to have at the party, but not the kind of guy you want to trust with any responsibility whatsoever. Charles is an idiot. Like, throughout this movie, oh my god.
Maybe we could stay there.
He warned us to stay away from there.
He is constantly making the worst decisions and encouraging everyone to go along with him. But let's look at a few more of those decisions. Now, while he's trying to drive the coach just into town, these horses, they seem to have the mind of their own, and they bring him up to the castle. And again, Charles is like, you know what? This is probably fine. We can just chill at the castle now. They go in. There's already places set for them at the table. Even when he goes up to their bedrooms, he finds their luggage has already been unloaded. Like, there are like a dozen red flags here. Clearly something scary is going on. They're like being led as lambs to the slaughter. But again, Charles is like, this will be cool. Time to check off another trope because there is a dark, spooky guy who appears who lives at the castle, and he's shrouded in darkness. Is it Dracula? No. It's actually Philip Latham as Klove. Klove reveals himself to be a servant of the master of the house who has passed away, and his master was Count Dracula.
Who was your master?
His name was Count Dracula.
It's kind of funny to hear somebody just casually say the name Count Dracula and nobody reacts to it because the name doesn't really mean anything to them, so it makes sense. It kind of reminds me of in Star Trek Into Darkness when Benedict Cumberbatch announces that his name is Khan.
My name is Khan.
And nobody reacts to it because none of these characters know who Khan is. It's it's kind of funny for an audience member in the know, which is like, everyone. After a delightful dinner that they happily consume and don't for a second worry that they might be getting poisoned or drugged.
I'm sorry if we appear a little dense.
They go off to bed, and I quite enjoy this banter that goes on here between Charles and Diana.
Do you enjoy your port, cigars, and man's talk?
No, not very much. But then, it takes female company for me to
By the way, Diana is played by Susan Farmer, who I actually quite liked in this H.P. Lovecraft film that Boris Karloff was in called Die Monster Die. Here's where I just got to say, I used to like this movie less than I do now because I thought the characters were pretty boring. And I do think on the page, the characters are kind of boring, but I've grown to love them because I've grown to love so many of them in a lot of different Hammer movies and Gothic horror movies around this time period. Familiarity grows affection, and that's kind of what happened for me with this cast, except for the one who plays Charles's brother. Again, I have no idea who that guy is. He is a nothing character. He offers zero character traits whatsoever. He's got first victim written all over his forehead. Another thing is, I feel like this guy and Charles shouldn't be the siblings. I think Charles and Helen should be the siblings because they have this kind of bickering relationship. They're always like at each other.
That was the third time you supplied everybody with drinks.
I know.
They're total opposites, and they just feel like brother and sister, a bickering sibling relationship. Whereas I don't see much of a sibling relationship at all between Charles and other guy. I mean, they seem more like in-laws. So that was a missed opportunity, but it may be that they kind of underestimated the way that Barbara Shelley and Francis Matthews would have this kind of antagonistic chemistry because they're both just really good actors. Now, if you watch my review for the last movie, The Brides of Dracula, you'll see that as soon as they go into the castle in that movie, I am gushing about the incredible atmosphere of that film. This one, I haven't mentioned it yet. It's because I'm just not wowed by it. It's a totally different set than in Horror of Dracula. It looks very different. And it just feels kind of small to me, less extravagant. There's not as much decoration around. The set design, though it is by Bernard Robinson, like the first two films, it does feel like a bit of a downgrade to me. Now, around this time, Helen and her husband, Boring Guy, have this kind of, typical husband and wife thing in the bed where she's like, oh, I heard a noise. And he's like, it's probably fine. All right, I'll go check. I mean, come on. We've all been there, haven't we, fellas? All right, sometimes I hear the noise. And he goes and wanders around for a while and stands around a while until, Klove stabs him in the back. Yes, he had first victim written on his forehead, and that came to fruition. And now Klove is very slowly and ritualistically going to sacrifice him, tying his legs to a rope, raising him up, dangling him head first over a coffin marked Dracula. And here we get a fantastic resurrection sequence where Klove slits the guy's throat. Blood pours down. Like, this is a gory moment for an old Hammer movie. And we just get this fantastic resurrection where we very slowly see like a body more come together, fading in layer by layer. Smoke is used really, really well to kind of cover up the transitions between the forms. I mean, resurrecting a vampire is smoky business. I think we all know that. And I like that the smoke doesn't clear and we see Christopher Lee. They hold that reveal even more. And then 47 minutes into this movie, his hand comes up. And I kind of like that you can tell that he's not wearing clothes, by the way, because that would just seem less realistic that his clothes reform. And I believe that will happen later in the series. But his hand, Christopher Lee is so good. Just the performance of his hand, it's pretty creepy. But is it a problem that it takes 47 minutes to finally get Dracula in this? Even just Dracula's hand. Maybe a little, but not much. Like, I actually quite enjoy this movie up to this point. It's not near as interesting as the first two movies in the series. Like, Brides of Dracula, the first act of that film is so intriguing as it goes, and I'm just so engaged in this fascinating story that it tells just in the first act. This movie's not so much like that. This movie feels like a slasher movie or a just very typical Gothic horror movie. And Hey, that's what Marcus Hearn said. By the way, we got to add to the checklist. Vampire resurrection. That's a trope, right? It's got to be in this series for sure. Actually, to be honest, my feelings have evolved much like my feelings on a lot of other slasher sequels. Pretty much the same as like Halloween 2, Nightmare on Elm Street 4, two movies that like I thought were okay the first time I saw them. And just upon repeat viewings, they become total comfort watches for me. Despite the fact that they're not fascinating stories or anything like that, they're just comfortable, trope-filled, spooky time horror movies that I enjoy, and Dracula Prince of Darkness is exactly that for me. When boring guy husband doesn't come back to bed, Helen goes around looking around for him, and she sees his dead body and screams, but you know she's probably also thinking, I told you guys so, vindicated. You gotta know she's kind of excited. And then 49 minutes into this movie, we get the full reveal of Christopher Lee as Dracula. And it's a fantastic reveal. He is lit so well in this movie to just seem so dark and ominous and foreboding. And he's really pale in this shot. This is the most pale that he'll look in the whole movie. And I think that's because he hasn't had a whole lot of blood yet. He's got to suck a little bit more to get the color back in his cheeks. But I really like how they make him look. Like, it doesn't look like he's caked in cheesy makeup. This is just a pale, frightening, red-eyed, fang-bearing monster, and he's gonna suck Helen's blood. While I might expect Dracula to just kill them all that night, I guess this all happened kind of close to sunrise, because after this, Dracula had to go down for a little cat nap, and we cut to the next day, to daylight. Now Charles and Diana are wandering around. They can't find their friends / brother anywhere, and Diana says, I want to leave.
I want to leave.
This seems kind of heartless, because like, wow, you're just gonna leave them there? Like, your brother-in-law and sister-in-law? Like, that seems kind of crazy. Charles goes ahead, gets her out of there, and then goes back. And around that time, Klove comes down and meets up with Diana.
Your husband sent me to fetch you in the carriage, ma'am.
I have to take you back up to the castle. And she goes with him.
What?
So on one hand, this whole thing was pointless, like him taking her back out of there, then going back himself. She just gets brought back anyway, so we didn't need any of that. And also, like, Diana, what are you thinking? Like, you were just really creeped out by this castle. Your friends, siblings-in-law disappeared, and you were creeped out by Klove. You said that earlier, and now you're just gonna get in the coach with them. You know, people talk a lot about bad decision-making in horror movies, and I think a lot of times it's kind of overblown. But this is some bad decision making in a horror movie. But when it gets back to the castle, I guess this whole going back and forth kind of took all day. It's now nightfall again, and she finds vampire Helen. And while Barbara Shelley didn't really get to show how great she is when she's just playing boring stick in the mud, but always the voice of reason, Helen, she really does with her vampire version. Barbara Shelley is an incredible vampire, one of the most iconic vampires in all of Hammer. Just love her in this. So creepy, the teeth, it looks so good. And then when Dracula appears in this scene, I really realized that the atmosphere of this castle has got a huge upgrade as soon as Christopher Lee comes in. And it's not just Lee, they really make the place look much creepier. And Dracula is set in front of this giant red wall. It looks astoundingly beautiful. And this right here is probably the most iconic shot out of the whole franchise. Christopher Lee looks incredible here. But here I've got to address a very important sticking point of this movie. The one thing that everybody talks about. Have you noticed Dracula is not talking? He's actually not going to talk through this whole movie. And this is the only Hammer Dracula film where he doesn't talk. There's some conflicting reports about this, and you kind of have to choose for yourself who you want to believe, because we don't know for sure. Christopher Lee insists that the dialogue Jimmy Sangster wrote for him was so bad, he refused to say it. And him saying this is pretty in character for him. Christopher Lee did not really like playing Dracula for Hammer. He loved the character of Dracula. He loved Bram Stoker's novel. But the character of Dracula in Hammer horror films is pretty different. He's much less articulate. And Christopher Lee didn't like it. He wanted to play the character much closer to Stoker's vision than Hammer ever wanted him to play. So he didn't really like doing this, and he came back to play this character for Hammer over and over again, very reluctantly. And it's going to become quite a saga as we talk about all the reasons that he comes back. So he says the script is so bad, he would not even say these lines. But Jimmy Sangster, the writer, disputes this. He says that he never wrote any dialogue because he wanted Dracula to just be a feral monster in this. And I do kind of like the idea that Dracula used to be more human when he was just a regular vampire, but now he's a vampire that has been killed, died, and resurrected. And perhaps now he's just even less human than he used to be. I think that's a cool idea. So who do I believe, Jimmy Sangster or Christopher Lee? It's kind of weird because I think Jimmy Sangster has much more reason to lie about this to protect his reputation as a writer of dialogue. But I do kind of believe Jimmy Sangster, actually, because if you look at his script for the original Horror of Dracula, Dracula only talked when he was putting up a pretension of pretending to be a normal guy in front of Jonathan Harker. Once he reveals he's a vampire, he doesn't talk again in the rest of the movie. He's just a feral beast. There's no such scene in this movie. He never needs to pretend in front of anyone. Everyone knows he's a vampire from the second he shows up on screen. So it is very well in line. So like, I kind of believe Jimmy Sangster. I don't think he wrote any dialogue. It's possible Christopher Lee is just kind of confusing this with the many other Dracula films he made in which he hated the dialogue. Charles and Diana, by the way, Charles and Diana, I literally just made the royal family connection. I'm not really into the royal family, but that just dawned on me. They're able to ward off the vampires with crosses, escape, and while they're escaping, who rolls up but Father Sandor, coming to the rescue and saying, "I told you so."
I warned you not to go anywhere near the castle, Mr. Kent.
He takes them back to his monastery to regroup, to recover, and figure out how to move forward. And I gotta say, while Charles is discussing this horrible situation with Father Sandor, Francis Matthews, he's not really selling the emotion of this. I think Francis Matthews was fantastic as Peter Cushing's assistant in The Revenge of Frankenstein. In this movie, he's a little more okay, but the character is kind of dumb.
I'm sorry if we appear a little dense.
Makes a lot of bad decisions and just a fun-loving loose guy. I guess it doesn't really demand that much of him. Okay, by the way, my cat wanted a little attention and I've shown him in videos before and people always ask to see more Poe. This is Poe, so let's say hi to Poe. So at this point, we actually get a really cool Salem's Lot-like moment where Helen, vampire Helen, comes up to Diana's window, coaxes her to open up the window, and then who pops out but Christopher Lee Dracula. I gotta say, this is the only moment. I think Helen was really cool and creepy in this moment, but where Dracula doesn't come across all that cool. I don't know, seeing Christopher Lee just kind of poke his head in the window and be like, "Oh, I gotta go run," and then running off. The fellas at the monastery do successfully catch Helen, though, and drag her back for a staking.
If you wish to see the destruction of the horror spawned by Count Dracula, come with me. But I warn you, it is not a sight for the squeamish.
The Hammer Dracula movies are full of really good staking sequences, and this is fantastic. Barbara Shelley gives a fantastic performance as a feral, monstrous creature, and they stake her. Father Sandor, of course, explained to Charles, "We only kill the evil. This is but a shell." But while this is going on, Ludwig goes, by the way, we haven't even mentioned Ludwig. He's this guy who's living at the monastery who apparently had a run-in at the castle and survived, but now that Dracula's back, he's back under Dracula's power, and he lures Diana over to Dracula in another room. And here we get this fantastic moment where, you know, if Christopher Lee wanted to play Dracula more like in the novel, this is a moment right out of the novel where Dracula makes Mina drink his own blood from his chest. It's commonly accepted now as a way to truly turn someone into a vampire, to make them drink actual vampire blood. There's a really good representation of this moment with Gary Oldman and Winona Ryder in the 90s version, but this is a fantastic version. It is so creepy. He doesn't even bite Diana yet. He is just opening his chest, cutting down, having her drink. And it's a really good alternative. You know, we've had so many Dracula biting sequences in this series. We're going to have many more to come. This is a nice, different moment with some really cool visuals. Now Dracula whisks Diana away back to his castle. Father Sandor and Charles are hot on his tail. And here's where Charles is really coming into his own in his own hero's journey.
No, you look after her. I'll take care of him.
And he figures out that Dracula is standing on ice. It seems to be perpetual winter around Dracula's castle. It doesn't look like winter anywhere else, so I don't really understand this. But there's a whole sheet of ice all around the castle, and when he shoots the ice and Dracula acts scared of it, Father Sandor realizes, oh, running water. Vampires can be killed by drowning in running water. Now, if you're mostly just used to seeing like a lot of kind of mainstream vampire movies and such like that, you might be kind of confused by this. This is one of those ways to kill vampires that does not show up near as commonly as crosses, staking, sunlight, holy water, any of that stuff. You don't see this very often, but it's actually very deep into folklore that vampires cannot cross running water and can be drowned in it. In fact, not even just vampires, but evil spirits in general. It was very common in old time beliefs. There's even accounts of people way back in olden times burying people on islands just to ensure that their spirit, their ghost, could not cross the water and go haunt people. So I really like that this movie incorporates some different vampire folklore than a lot of other vampire movies do. I really dig that conceptually. Practically speaking, it's not one of the best Dracula death sequences by any means. He just kind of slides into the water, and that's it. It's a little anticlimactic for a movie that has built up Christopher Lee and Dracula as being so awesome. He's fantastic in almost every moment of this movie. To kill him this way, it's okay. But this is really where the series is starting to become a slasher series. Much like Freddy Krueger with Nightmare on Elm Street, it becomes very important in each movie. How does he get resurrected and how does he get killed? So let's go ahead and rate Dracula Prince of Darkness. Now for atmosphere, I'm going to give this a 7. Because when you compare this movie to just horror movies in general, it has really good atmosphere for sure. I like the gothicness of it. I especially love the castle when Dracula shows up. I mean, the red behind him is by far the best moment of atmosphere in this whole movie, and I really like the outside of the castle too. A set that would get reused in Rasputin the Mad Monk, because these movies, as well as Plague of the Zombies and The Reptile, were all filmed at the same time and all released in 1966. A fascinating experiment that Hammer tried in this particular year. Now for characters, this is another one where I'm going to give it a 7. I do think it's not amazing in the character kind of realm. Now I will say, while I do kind of miss Peter Cushing as Van Helsing, I think Andrew Keir as Father Sandor is a darn good replacement. I think he's really fun. He's funny. I love this actor. You know, Charles is dumb. Helen is a stick in the mud until she becomes a vampire. The characters are not great, but they're good enough, and I enjoy them because I enjoy these actors from seeing them in a lot of other movies like this. But Dracula is fantastic. So this movie's got a 10 out of 10 vampire. So I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 for all the characters as a whole. For story, this is going to get a 6. This is not a fascinating, intriguing story by any means. It is super typical. Marcus Hearn was right. It's like a checklist of tropes and cliches. You know, some of them weren't quite as cliche when they did them, but you know, even so, I'm not super engaged with this story, but I think it's fun. It's cozy. It's a lot like Halloween 2 for me. You know, a lesser version of something I love, but I still love it. But for scares, we're going to give a 9 out of 10. I actually think for Christopher Lee performance, this is probably an upgrade from Horror Dracula. He is monstrous. He is scary in this movie. And Barbara Shelley is a great vampire as well. Her staking sequence is very intense. This is a great movie for spooky content, absolutely. But I still don't think this is Christopher Lee's best performance as Dracula. That's a movie yet to come, so stay tuned for this series. There's another one in the series that might just get that coveted 10 out of 10. All in all, I think I can comfortably put this movie at a 7 out of 10. It is a fun, typical Hammer horror film.